I am Jeff Rosen, and so looking forward to this conversation with three of the most distinguished university presidents in the country. Three people who've done more to think about the state of free speech on campus and in America than anyone else, and we have so much to learn from their wisdom. I'm going to begin with Bob Zimmer because Chicago has inspired many across the country by issuing a set of principles called the Chicago Principles that guide free speech on campus. And yesterday, Bob, I plugged the National Constitution Center's amazing interactive constitution, which unites liberal and conservative scholars to write about every clause of the Constitution. And the First Amendment provision is written by Jeff Stone, who wrote the Chicago Principles and is the provost, or was the provost of Chicago and the dean of the law school. So Robert Zimmer, what are the Chicago Principles and how do they guide free speech at Chicago?
Yeah, so when I put the committee together with Jeff Stone as the chair, the goal was not, how do you think about free expression on college campuses or at the University of Chicago? Rather, the goal was to say the university has a very long-standing commitment to free expression, open discourse, and intellectual challenge. And the task of this committee was to articulate them because they needed a statement. We needed a clear statement to have a set of principles on which we could act. Fundamentally, this is a set of statements about free expression that reflect the point of view of the University of Chicago for a long time, continuing today, about their importance to the most powerful, challenging, and empowering education. We view our mission as very clear, which is to deliver that education, to have the most unchilled environment for faculty research, and that type of education and that type of research that we want to have demands in an open, challenging environment. And the statements that were made in the Chicago Principles and by the Stone Committee were very much in accord with that history and very much were clear that this is a bedrock principle of the university.
Thank you so much. Dear friends, Google the principles because they are significant and they essentially adopt the American First Amendment jurisprudence that speech can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, with exceptions for defamation, intentional harassment, and the like. President Thomas, you are at Morehouse, which is one of three all-male colleges, one of the historically African-American college. How are you finding the free speech environment there, and how does the fact that it's all-male influence that environment?
Great question. There doesn't seem to be, at least on the surface, a lot of tension around free speech or voice. Part of that, I think, is that we may actually have the opposite challenge with speech, which is surfacing unpopular speech in the community. And there's also the question of expression. Part of the First Amendment isn't simply about what you say, it's also about how you present yourself. And we are a college with many traditions, with a history of being all male, and questions arise about the expression of that and those traditions. I think in general it's a very open environment. We also have another dynamic, which is our sister college is an all-women's school on the other side of the fence, if you will, literally, Spelman College. And there, the question of the voice of the women of Spelman and the men of Morehouse around issues like sexuality, sexual engagement, feminism, that's often where tension emerges, and our students work at that. And I think the faculty have been open to it. Another area for us around expression is in the spring, I dismissed Papa John's, who were vendors on our campus, and made the decision that the racist comments made by their CEO constituted a violation of our principles at the college. And there was some question about that as a suppression of speech, and whether or not we should have penalized a company for the statements of their CEO. And some people did see my decision as a suppression of free speech.
And what was your response?
My response was that the CEO of Papa John's was also the founder of Papa John's. And organizations do embody their leaders, and in particular their founders. And that as a historically black college, to maintain doing business with an organization whose leader essentially denigrated the population that we are primarily serving was something that I couldn't, in good conscience, continue to do.
President Sullivan, you presided at the University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson, one of the greatest defenders of free expression in our history, and yet, invoking Thomas Jefferson, you provoked controversy and presided with great sensitivity and nuance over free speech controversies, including rallies involving Unite the Right. Tell us about those controversies and how you dealt with them.
Sure. I just have to say, since I am an alumna of the University of Chicago, that when the Chicago principles came out, a lot of Virginia alumni called or wrote me to say, why don't you endorse these principles and stand with the University of Chicago? And I pointed out that our principles were the First Amendment, you know, so Chicago is standing with us. You know, unlike my two colleagues here, I represent a public institution. We're an arm of the state. And so we operate in a very different way from private institutions. I can't ban guns, for example. People in Virginia can have both open and closed carry. And citizens of the Commonwealth are entitled to walk our grounds. We can keep those guns out of our buildings, but that's all we can do. That became complicated with Unite the Right, because not only did they show up in a surprise rally, which we didn't anticipate was going to happen that Friday night, but for most of that weekend, they were armed to the teeth. In fact, they were better armed than the police were. And so we had an interesting configuration there of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, because besides you're having a right to speak, I have a right to refuse to listen to you, but when you've got a gun trained on me, it's a little bit hard for me to exercise that right. So it was a difficult situation for us. As I say, we were not expecting anything to happen on our grounds, certainly not on Friday. We were very well prepared for Saturday. One of our mistakes was assuming that this group was actually organized, because there were people who held themselves out as organizers, who, by the way, did not tell us the truth about what their intentions were. But it turned out that many people in this group had no intention of following their so-called leaders. They were going to do whatever they wanted to do. So the agreement that the rally on Saturday would be held at noon and that the protesters would go through certain prearranged channels so the police give them protection was completely overturned, because at 7 a.m. they began converging from all directions on the park where the rally was going to be held. And then so did the counter-protesters, and so there were skirmishes everywhere. And by 11:30, the governor declared a state of emergency, and I was told to close the university. So I did, but I did make an executive decision, because there was a wedding scheduled for the chapel that afternoon at 3 o'clock. You have to make those reservations more than a year in advance. And I was not going to tell that bride and groom that they could get married. So we stationed police at the chapel, and the wedding went on. But that was the only thing that happened that afternoon at the university. But there was much discussion about it afterwards. A lot of this discussion was about the police and whether they were prepared or not prepared, or organized or not organized, and so on. But the more fundamental issues of what do you do when a group of angry and armed men are marching across your campus chanting things like "Jews will not replace us," a sentiment that most of the university found really abhorrent. So we spent the next year thinking about our time, place, manner policy, and had vigorous debates among our First Amendment scholars and others at the university to try and come up with a solution so that what happened that Friday couldn't happen again, but speakers, even those with unpopular views, still had places to speak where police could protect them if there were counter-protesters, and we could make the situation physically safe. One thing I have to say, and presidents face this a lot, is we cannot make it psychologically safe. For students who encounter ideas that are antithetical to them, that are straightforward attacks on perhaps their faith beliefs, the groups they come from, that are threatening them in other ways, that actually is part of education. It doesn't necessarily feel good. I believe it was St. Thomas Aquinas who said, learning always makes a bloody entrance.
Can I comment on?
Please do. I just one
please.
brief follow-up, and then of course, please respond. What was the balance you struck in the wake of the Charlottesville protests? The ACLU decided not to defend protesters who were armed on the grounds that being armed itself threatened imminent violence. Critics said that's not imminence; it's a Second Amendment right. So how did you balance the two?
Well, we talked with our architecture faculty about whether our lawn could be construed as a facility, because under state law, we can ban weapons from a facility. And so the lawn is a totally enclosed space surrounded by students' living areas and some faculty living areas with limited egress. There's only a few ways to get in and out. And so the architecture faculty offered the opinion that that was a facility. And so our Board of Visitors banned weapons from that facility. So that's one way that we began to handle that. But the other was, about the only time, place, manner regulation we had was that you could not use amplified sound outside a classroom because you couldn't disrupt the class. We decided instead that that offered too many acres and acres of land for people to have protests where the police couldn't necessarily protect them. So we identified 9 areas on the grounds, popular gathering spaces where people would normally meet. And we declared those to be places that could be reserved for any kind of free speech activity, leafleting, speeches, debates, whatever, with a very easy reservation form. And the purpose of the reservation is just so that the police know where people are going to be. Because obviously one of the things that happened that Friday night at our university was our police could not protect the students who ended up in a violent clash with some of these protesters.
Thank you. Bob, yes, Teresa said that Virginia stands with the First Amendment, not the University of Chicago. That's fighting words, so please respond.
Yeah, well, there's actually really interesting point here, several interesting points. So first of all, of course, we're not, as a private institution, First Amendment doesn't apply to us. So our position is not we like the First Amendment. Our position is we actually like giving a difficult, challenging, and empowering education for which intellectual challenge and open discourse is necessary. But a really interesting thing is, and this is not the case here, but you see some state universities, I would argue, hiding behind the First Amendment, saying, I have to do things because of the First Amendment, but when it comes down to trying to set a tone on their campus in which people are not ostracized for having different views, in which intellectual challenge is accepted and in fact encouraged, in which people's assumptions are to be challenged, including their own, that they're not so interested in. And in the same way that the First Amendment does certain things and creates certain obligations on the part of state universities, it doesn't actually put obligations on them for setting certain tones about the nature of the education they give. So I think that just saying we have the First Amendment, you'll forgive me, is not sufficient. But I think the point you make, that you made about the importance of not feeling safe when safe means to do with ideas, and is really a whole other point that not everybody embraces just because they're subject to the First Amendment.
Well, you put on the table a topic that I'd love all of us to dig into, and that is the question of intellectual diversity among the students. I mean, we can debate where you draw the legal line when it comes to unpopular speakers, but I've heard all of you say that really today there's a trouble with students listening to other points of view. And the tribalism and polarization that has infected the rest of our politics is also affecting our campuses in ways that measurably affect public discourse and the quality of education. President Thomas, how much intellectual or ideological diversity is there at Morehouse, and what are you doing to foster it?
I would actually argue that at Morehouse College, which is a historically black college for men, we probably don't have enough ideological diversity being surfaced, and consideration of different models and different assumptions about how we move, in particular, the black community forward and globally. So you just take, for example, I met last Thursday, I had a representative of the student Republicans come to my office. I do office hours on Thursday, and he wanted to propose that we celebrate one of our alums, who's a Republican, African-American, who ran for president. And I asked him, I said, well, how many Republicans are there in the Republican student group? And he said, 3. He said, and there's, there may be a few in the closet. And that just made me wonder, whether enough of the differences of opinion and models and ideologies that are out there surface. Where I think if there is a tension in our community, it's probably around sexuality, sexual identity. And to Dr. Sullivan's point, I think this question of how you make people psychologically safe is the most challenging one for us as administrators. I was dean at Georgetown and also a professor in the administration when I was at Harvard. And I can remember times when black students came to me in those environments where they were definitely in the minority and had some proposal about the administration should take a stand to suppress some speech or views. And I never supported that. And part of my speaking to them was to say, whenever we suppress speech, it will always come back to hurt us once you set that in motion. But the question of psychological safety is one that I think I struggle with as a leader, even at Morehouse College.
Fascinating. Professor Sullivan, how would you analyze the combination of these factors we're identifying: a desire for psychological safety, a tendency to demonize the other, an increasing polarization and lack of civility? Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, in their new book, The Coddling of the American Mind, attribute all of these factors to the cause of our free speech crisis on campus and say that it's a phenomenon of the past decade. Does that make sense to you, or where do you think all this is coming from?
I think it does make some sense. It is helpful to think about the political climate of the country and its polarization. Virginia is a purple state, and we're required by legislature to admit 70% of our students from Virginia. So we represent that purpleness inside our student body. Larry Sabato, our eminent political scientist, told me of a survey he'd done of the entering class that showed they were 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democrat, and 1/3 independent. So there's room for a lot of discussion going on there among the students. I do think that it's true that faculty in the humanities And some of the social sciences at every institution, not just at Virginia, do tend to lean left. That's less true of scientists, engineers, business professors, and so on. But one way we've sought to deal with this is in terms of the intentional invitation of outside speakers, particularly our Miller Center for Public Affairs, which invited all the announced candidates for president in the last election to come to the university and speak. And we had 3 who came. Students lined up hours in advance to be able to come in. There was no problem with those in terms of appropriate listening and not heckling and so on. But I do think that sometimes students with very conservative points of view hesitate to express those views in class. They do, however, find other groups of like-minded students. Our College of Republicans is quite a lot larger than yours. And with over 800 student groups to choose from, almost everybody has found a place of some psychological comfort. But I worry about that too, because the tribalization means that we still aren't speaking to one another. We're just finding our own niche and pulling off and staying there. I think that's not just true of the college campus. I think that's true of a lot of the country right now.
President Zimmer, you have identified the polarization of political rhetoric as affecting the campus climate, as well as the decline in civility in high schools as an ideal which is taught, and noted that this began before 2016. How would you analyze where this phenomenon is coming from?
Yeah, well, first, I think it's important just from a larger contextual point of view to recognize that this is not a singular phenomenon. I mean, the question about free expression, free speech, comes under attack in various ways over history, back to the founding of the first university, even in Bologna. But, and certainly in the United States in the 50s, it was a big issue on university campuses. So it's not as if a movement toward closing of discourse is a new phenomenon. It just appears periodically, and it appears in part because people really are, generally speaking, quite uncomfortable with the free speech of those that they disagree with them about things that they feel very strongly about. Everyone's in favor of their free speech. It's a great idea. And people I agree with, absolutely. And people who have moral views or political views or religious views that are antithetical to yours, a lot of people are not so sure about their commitment to it. So I would say that what you see periodically is the rising up of this phenomenon that's always just lurking beneath the surface of maintaining an environment of free speech and free expression on campus is fundamentally difficult and can't be taken for granted and is not the normal state. The normal state is you strive to have it, but right below the surface there are all these forces. The particular forces can change over time. But the one thing I would like to kind of toss on the table here that you alluded to is what I would say is a kind of privileging of feelings, which is, some of you may have seen the article, I don't remember which newspaper it was in, but there was a recent article in which a group of high school students was saying nobody should have to make an in-class presentation if it made them uncomfortable. And in fact, it got extended, and one student was quoted as saying nobody should have to do anything that makes them feel uncomfortable.
Now, apologies to members of the audience at this panel.
Now, part of the problem with this is, kids like adults say kind of funny things sometimes, but the trouble is there is an entire environment right now in a lot of high schools where this is just what I would say is an extension of the environment. It may be an extreme extension, but there's this enormous sense of everybody needs to be protected all the time, particularly from language. And while I totally admit that I'm not a high school educator, I don't pretend to be, but I have started talking to high school leaders about the question, are you preparing students to be in a university, an environment of open discourse and intellectual challenge, or aren't you? And I think some places are paying a lot of attention to it, but in general, I think a lot more can be done because of the nature of the emphasis in high school right now.
This is a crucial challenge. I told our friends yesterday about this exciting initiative the Constitution Center has with the College Board to teach First Amendment principles to all 3 to 5 million AP students. This reiterates the necessity of teaching not only the doctrine, but also the need to listen to ideas with which you disagree. And many of you said yesterday, why should it be limited to AP kids? We've got to bring it to all high school kids, and that's absolutely right. And we must find distribution partnerships, like we're talking to the Philadelphia school district, and I love your thoughts about other school districts around the country that can bring these crucial principles of civil dialogue and free expression to students across the country. President Thomas, how do you teach this on campus? If students are coming in expecting to be protected from emotional upset, how do you teach them to listen to ideas with which they disagree?
I think it's a few things. One, what I have always tried to do and tried to teach in the development of instructors, which I've had a lot of experience with when I was department chair, is bringing balance, if you will, to the discussion rather than leading with my political or social views. Also, you know, I think in Dr. Zimmer's point made me think about what happens even in high school, this question of comfort, but there's also the question of what's the responsibility of educators to understand what we actually might be doing to individuals when we put them in those uncomfortable moments. And I'll give you an example. When my daughter was in the 7th grade, she went to a private school, few African Americans, kids. And the teacher was trying to teach about slavery. And in the past, she had randomly put kids in groups to be, you know, to kind of take the role of being a slave owner, right? And in the random assignment, my daughter wound up being in the group where she was supposed to imagine what it was like being a slave. And it was traumatizing. And so part of what I think, where I think the breakdown is in our ability to help young people have discourse is that we're not competently trained as educators to manage those discussions and to also see their connection to the identities of our students. And so we avoid them. And if we really want to go at this, we have to think about how we educate and equip our teachers in the classroom, our professors, to understand what the fault lines are as we engage it. Otherwise, we just shy away from it, right? And we bail on it. Or we treat the conversation as though it's just a clinical conversation and doesn't have emotion attached to it. And I think we're largely ill-equipped as educators in this country to be the guides for our young people. And that's why we get what we get.
I'd love each of your thoughts on solutions because it's such an incredibly important problem. President Sullivan, Dr. Thomas just said instructors should present both sides of the argument. What would you do both on campus and also in high schools to teach kids how to listen to differing points of view?
I have to say one of the really formative experiences for me was being a debater. And I started that in high school and continued it in college. I married my debate partner, as a matter of fact.
That's a very distinguished debate partner. One of the great religion professors in the country.
It was really it was a terrific way to learn to deal with opposing arguments as arguments. We're not doing a very good job these days of teaching rhetoric in the traditional classical style. And so if I make an argument with which you disagree, you learn to deal with that argument, not with the person. And I regret that we don't seem to be doing that with enough of our high school and college populations right now. I will say also that there are some faculty members who strongly disagree that they should present both sides of an issue. They believe they should present the truth, and based on their scholarship, they believe they know what the truth is, and that is their approach. In some fields, let's say mechanical engineering, that probably makes a good amount of sense. But in other fields, my own, for example, I'm a sociologist, there's lots of room for controversy. And most good instructors I know find ways to incorporate that inside the class so that students get the opportunity to hear opposing views, hear different sides of an issue, perhaps debated in the classroom, but with the instructor kind of setting boundaries so that students understand that this is not something that that goes on outside the classroom as well. You don't dislike a person because of the point of view they expressed. That's not the point of the exercise. I actually worry more about the hours when the students are outside of class. There are many more hours outside of class when they're on our campuses, and I think that much of the most difficult situations I've encountered have come then. It's with student organizations, it's with interactions inside residence halls and so on. Many times the residence hall is the first time a young person has been with people who are substantially different from him or her. They don't come from the same religious background, ethnic background, linguistic background. They come from different parts of the world or just different parts of the state. And dealing with all of that is, I think, where most of our incidents come up.
Fascinating and great solutions. President Zimmer, so eager for your solutions about how to solve the most urgent problem facing the American student population, namely how to train people to listen to opinions with which they disagree on campus and in high school.
Yeah, well, I think an important point is again, it's not a theological principle. It's really, if you're talking to somebody who's trying to get an education or is sitting in a school, the question is, how are you going, what are you trying to teach them? You're trying to convey truth, or you're trying to teach them how to think? And they're not the same thing. And certainly for us, we've always taken the point of view that what we're trying to do is teach them how to think. And why? Because it's going to empower them for the rest of their life, because they're going to be dealing with complex issues. Whatever truth you teach them now is, it's not going to serve them well. So I think certainly in a college environment, I think you actually need to have clarity about what it is you're doing. What is the meaning of the education you're delivering? And you actually need to explain to students. I mean, they're walking onto campus, and students, some will know something about what their education is for, what it's going to be about. Some will know less. But convincing them in an ongoing way that this constant challenging of assumptions and understanding arguments and understanding what works and what doesn't is in fact the core of the education. It's not as if it's a nice thing to do. If you're actually not presenting the complexity of the issue you're talking about, you're actually not educating people very well. So you have to understand what it is you're doing when you're educating. And I think the whole thing, for a university campus at least, starts from clarity about what is the education we're offering, what are the key points of that, and then how do we talk about it to our students? Not only deliver that type of education, but how do we talk about it to our students so they understand that? And they can argue with you about whether it's you've drawn the right conclusions or not, which is totally fine.
That distinction between teaching truth and teaching people how to think is absolutely central. All right, now I'm going to ask all of you for some free advice. The Constitution Center's approach to this problem is this. First, we only debate constitutional issues, not political issues. In other words, when we have a debate, we ask not, is gun control a good or bad idea, but does the Second Amendment allow it or prohibit it? And by asking people to set aside their political views and focus on the text, history, and structure and doctrine of the Constitution, you elevate the debate above partisanship. And then when we always have both sides represented, and we vote at the end of the debates, and the winner is the side that has changed the most minds. So there are weekly We the People podcasts that I'm going to plug, where I get to interview the top liberal and conservative scholars on these constitutional issues. There are debates traveling around the country and so forth. President Thomas, would it be useful to take the really controversial questions that are tough to debate on campus because they lead to protests, like the constitutional issues involving affirmative action or immigration or Me Too and due process? And at the Constitution Center, which is this majestic building on Independence Mall, right across from Independence Hall, have the top liberal and conservative thinkers debate the questions. And then if you were designing a curriculum like this, would you bring in school kids to train them to do this as well? What's your reaction?
Well, I think there's value in that, in what you describe. I think another approach is that I've found useful in my 30 years being a teacher, is having people focus on what is the problem we are trying to solve. And what that often allows us to do is to unearth the different hypotheses about what's driving that problem and whether a particular solution is actually helping us solve the problem, whether it's the problem of access and equity in healthcare or in jobs, and if we get focused on the problem, my experience is we're often able to have a much more fulsome debate and exploration of different paths to solving that problem, rather than starting with, is affirmative action good or bad? Is it constitutional? That doesn't help us with the discussion about it.
Not with the policy discussion, but it does help you understand the legal discussion.
Helps you understand the legal.
Yeah.
But where the tension is in the implementation, in the attributions that get made, right? The stigma that often comes with a particular thing that might be legal or illegal. And I think engaging around, so what's the problem we're trying to solve, and getting people to understand that. And sometimes the solution we have isn't a perfect solution, but it's the best solution to address the problem.
That's a crucial thought, that the legal debates are not going to solve the policy questions. But I do want each of you to understand that in these constitutional debates, there are good arguments on both sides of almost all of them. These are close, hard questions. And regardless of what you think about the policy, you have an obligation to educate yourself enough about the best arguments on each side so you can make an informed decision. All right, let's use our short remaining time for closing statements. All three of you have done so much to cast light and illumination on the free discourse of ideas in this country. Just brief concluding words to the audience about why they should care about free expression on campus and how they can defend it. President Sullivan.
Fundamentally, universities won't exist if there's not the right to debate and talk about competing views. In science, for example, the only way progress is made is by scientists plainly using the scientific method but also taking the time to challenge what is accepted wisdom and try a new thing. At Virginia, one of those things was discovering that there was a bacterium that causes stomach ulcers. Nobody believed that was true. The doctor who came up with this hypothesis was ridiculed and jeered at, and today he has a Nobel Prize. That was a great example, but it doesn't just happen in science. We also have to be certain that it's happening in philosophy and linguistics, in the classes in English, that our students get exposed to it on every side. And ultimately, I think that they will find that they feel safer because they are equipped to deal with opposing arguments. That's where the real safety comes from.
Thank you so much, President Thomas.
I think this issue of First Amendment, free expression, free speech is important because the reality is that institutions like ours are creating the students who will ultimately provide leadership in the nation. And if we don't create environments for free expression and debate and exploration of ideas, we create a group of individuals who will be ill-equipped to lead in the world that they are going to inherit. And I think some of what may be the polarization that now exists in the country is that we have created a group of elites who didn't have the ability to be open to other sides and other realities. And what we've watched over the last 2 years is a rebellion against that. And it's a rebellion happening on the left and the right. I think it's part of the reemergence of the exploration and interest in socialism on the left. And it's the hardening that I think we see that some people associate with Trump on the right, but I think it's deeper than that.
Thank you for that. President Zimmer, last word to you.
Yeah, I'll be brief, and I just want to amplify these statements, both of which I agree with. And I'd just like to point out, when you listen to arguments these days, or you think about issues that need to be confronted, the lack of people's ability to listen, to understand cultural context, to actually understand that there's history that happened and is actually having an impact on us right now. It hasn't gone away. And there's a whole complexity of things that need to be understood in order to be dealing with the problems that we're confronting as a society and that individuals will confront in their own personal and professional lives. And the entire closing off of speech that some people are actually straightforward advocates for. I mean, this is not just, well, I don't like it so much. There are advocates for closing off of speech, and they're all over some college campuses. Fundamentally does long-standing harm to individuals' capacities and in terms of what it is they're going to be able to do the rest of their lives. And that in turn translates into a type of societal blindness to being able to deal with complex issues in a sophisticated way.
For all they have done to defend free expression on campus and in America, please join me in thanking our panelists.